The role of mountains in historic military victories. History's greatest victories were not won on the open plains of Europe or the sun-baked deserts of Africa, but in the savage embrace of Earth's mighty ranges, where the air grows thin and survival itself becomes an act of defiance. Here, among knife-edged ridges and frozen valleys, a special breed of warrior emerged. Commanders who turned nature's most forbidding terrain into their greatest ally. From Hannibal's elephants threading through Alpine passes to Finnish ski troops decimating Soviet divisions in moonlit forests, these battles showcase humanity's most audacious military achievements, where inferior forces used elevation, weather, and sheer audacity to achieve what should have been impossible. This is the story of 5 extraordinary victories that changed the course of history, where the mountains themselves became kingmakers, and generals learned that sometimes the path to glory leads straight up. Hannibal's legendary Alpine crossing. Snow whispered against canvas as the last elephant in line disappeared into the gloom of an approaching storm. Hannibal Barca stood at the vanguard of his army, watching 37 African war elephants and 50,000 men wind their way up into the Alps like a great serpent of bronze and leather. It was autumn of 218 BCE, and he was attempting what the Romans had dismissed as impossible, crossing the highest mountain range in Europe with the largest army ever assembled for such a feat. The crossing would become legend, but the raw numbers tell only part of the story. At night, his men huddled in caves and beneath makeshift shelters, while wolves prowled the perimeter, drawn by the scent of their dying pack animals. By day, they fought not just the gradient, but hostile Gallic tribes who rolled boulders down upon their columns and ambushed their foraging parties. When the army reached a section of path destroyed by a recent landslide, Hannibal's engineers accomplished one of the ancient world's most remarkable feats. They built a new road directly into the cliff face. Using fire to heat the rock and sour wine to crack it, they carved a passage wide enough for the elephants to pass single file. The price was staggering. By the time Hannibal's army descended into the Po Valley of northern Italy, he had lost nearly half his men and most of his irreplaceable elephants to cold, starvation, and combat. But in achieving the impossible, he had also outmaneuvered Rome's entire defensive strategy. The Romans had assumed the Alps formed an impenetrable barrier, positioning their legions to meet Hannibal along the expected coastal route. Instead, he appeared like a phantom in their undefended heartland, having transformed one of history's greatest obstacles into a path to strategic brilliance. The victories that followed, at Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and most famously at Cannae, would shake Rome to its foundations. But it was this first triumph, against nature itself, that made all the others possible. Hannibal proved that mountains were not walls but doorways for those bold enough to find the key. 2,000 years later, generals still study his crossing as the benchmark for what determined leadership can achieve when faced with supposedly insurmountable odds. The Innkeeper's War, Andreas Hofer's Tyrolean Rebellion. The French soldiers who marched into Tyrol in 1809 were veterans of Napoleon's Grande Armée, conquerors who had subdued the finest armies in Europe. They expected to easily crush the mountain province's hastily organized militia. What they found instead was a mastermind disguised as a barkeeper, Andreas Hofer, whose weathered face and traditional Tyrolean dress masked one of the most brilliant guerrilla commanders in military history. Hofer transformed the entire landscape into a weapon. His mountaineers would let French columns advance deep into narrow valleys, then trigger massive avalanches of rocks and logs that had been carefully prepared and balanced for exactly this purpose. The surviving French troops would flee directly into the crossfire of hidden marksmen who knew every ridge and gully intimately. Hofer's men could vanish into mountain paths and tunnels unknown to any outsider, emerging behind enemy lines to strike again and again before melting away into the peaks. The Battle of Bergerac showcased Hofer's genius for asymmetric warfare. With just 15,000 poorly equipped militia, he faced a French-Bavarian force of 25,000 professional soldiers, commanded by Marshal François-Joseph Lefebvre, one of Napoleon's most capable generals. Hofer positioned his men in small, mobile groups along the mountainsides, using a system of signal fires to coordinate their movements. When Lefebvre's troops advanced up the slopes in their traditional columns, Hofer's mountaineers struck from multiple directions simultaneously. The French found themselves fighting an enemy they couldn't effectively counter men who appeared suddenly from behind rocks to fire devastating volleys, then disappeared before any response could be organized. The victory at Bergerac sparked a full-scale rebellion that would drive both French and Bavarian forces from Tyrol. Hofer's tactics proved so effective that Napoleon himself was forced to divert precious resources from other campaigns to deal with this unexpected threat in the Alps. For a brief, brilliant moment, a network of innkeepers, hunters, and farmers had outwitted the greatest military machine of their age, transforming their homeland's vertical terrain into an insurmountable fortress. Though Hofer would ultimately face a firing squad in Mantua, his campaign revolutionized mountain warfare and demonstrated how intimate knowledge of difficult terrain could multiply a defender's fighting power far beyond mere numbers. The White War, conquering the impossible heights. At 12,000 feet above sea level, the Italian Alpine and Austrian Kaiserjäger fought the highest altitude war in human history. The Adamello-Presanella Massif wasn't just a battlefield, it was an otherworldly arena where armies battled in an environment closer to the moon than the muddy trenches of the Western Front. In this crystalline world of ice and granite, a single bullet could trigger an avalanche, and more men died from the cold than from combat. The Austrians believed they held an impregnable position atop the Adamello Glacier until April 1916, when Italian troops achieved what many considered impossible. Under the cover of a moonless night, they dismantled artillery pieces into loads no heavier than 90 pounds and began an ascent that would have given pause to the most hardened mountaineers. Moving in complete silence, each man tied to the next with ropes, they hauled their guns up near vertical ice walls. The temperature dropped to -30 degrees Fahrenheit. Their water froze in their canteens and their bread became too hard to eat. But they kept climbing. The assault on Adamello redefined the limits of military operations. Engineers carved an entire city into the ice barracks, hospitals, and ammunition depots connected by tunnels through the glacier. They strung aerial cableways across chasms to supply the troops, creating the world's highest logistics network. When conventional artillery proved ineffective at high altitudes due to the thin air, they designed new guns specifically for this astronomical battlefield. The soldiers themselves evolved into a new kind of warrior, part mountaineer, part ghost, who could move silently across ice fields in white camouflage, surviving conditions that would kill an unprepared man in hours. The price of this innovation was written in frostbite and hypothermia. Sentries would freeze to death at their posts, standing upright, rifles still in hand. Avalanches swallowed entire platoons whole. Yet somehow, in this realm where humans were never meant to wage war, the Alpine persevered. Their victory at Adamello didn't just secure a strategic position. It proved that with enough ingenuity and determination, soldiers could fight and win in environments previously thought impossible to survive, let alone conquer. They had literally taken warfare to new heights, and in doing so, wrote a chapter of military history unlike any other. Operation Compass, a strategic triumph in the desert. The Western Desert in 1940 wasn't just hot. It was an inferno where tanks melted into mirages and mountains appeared to dance in the shimmering air. Here, a British force of 36,000 men faced down 150,000 Italian troops in what should have been a hopeless battle. But General Richard O'Connor understood something his opponents didn't. In the desert, mountains weren't obstacles, they were opportunities. The Italian commander, Marshal Rodolfo Graziani, had arranged his forces in a series of fortified camps between the mountain passes, creating what he believed was an impenetrable defensive line at Sidi Barrani. O'Connor saw it differently. Where Graziani saw a wall, O'Connor saw gaps. He noticed that the Italians, fearing British naval power, had positioned their camps away from the coast. More importantly, they had left the harsh mountainous terrain to their south largely unguarded, believing no significant force could navigate through such inhospitable ground. O'Connor's masterstroke came in the form of a nocturnal ballet of military deception. He sent his tanks rumbling noisily near the Italian front lines each day, establishing a pattern. But on December 9th, these demonstrations were just a distraction. His main force had already slipped through the mountain passes under cover of darkness, using routes that local Bedouin guides had sworn were impassable to modern vehicles. The British emerged behind the Italian lines like phantoms from the mountains, striking camps that had all their defenses oriented in the wrong direction. The resulting victory defied military logic. In just 2 months, O'Connor's vastly outnumbered force captured 133,298 Italian prisoners, 420 tanks, and over 800 guns, while suffering fewer than 2,000 casualties. They had driven the Italians completely out of Egypt and pushed 500 miles into Libya, transforming what was supposed to be a limited raid into one of the most decisive victories in desert warfare history. The secret wasn't superior numbers or equipment. It was O'Connor's brilliant use of terrain that his enemy had written off as worthless. He had turned the very mountains that were supposed to protect the Italian flank into a highway for their destruction, proving that in warfare, assumptions about impossible terrain often create the deadliest vulnerabilities. The Winter War, a masterclass in asymmetric warfare. A Soviet commander peered through his binoculars at the snow-covered Finnish forest, seeing nothing but white silence. That silence was an illusion. Finnish ski troops, nicknamed White Death by terrified Soviet soldiers, were already sliding through the trees around his column's flanks. The winter of 1939 was the coldest in a century, and while Soviet tanks froze in place, Finnish soldiers glided across the landscape like Arctic wraiths, their white snowsuits rendering them nearly invisible against the endless drifts. The Finns had perfected a tactic called moti, an ancient word for a bundle of logs ready to be cut into firewood. Under the brilliant leadership of Carl Gustav Emil Mannerheim, they would isolate Soviet columns using terrain and weather, then slice them into smaller segments, just like a woodcutter splitting logs. These segments would be contained in natural bowls formed by hills and ridges, then systematically eliminated. The Soviets, trained for large-scale mechanized warfare, found their massive numerical advantage turned against them as their divisions were split, isolated and destroyed piece by piece. At the Battle of Suomussalmi, this strategy reached its lethal apex. 2 entire Soviet divisions, roughly 45,000 men, pushed through the forest along a narrow road, exactly as the Finns had anticipated. Finnish ski troops, moving silently through the deep snow, cut the road in multiple places. The Soviet armor and artillery, confined to the few passable routes, became sitting targets. Unable to maneuver in the deep snow, Soviet infantry could only watch as Finnish ski patrols appeared suddenly from the white void, struck with devastating accuracy and vanished like smoke. The temperature plunged to -40 degrees. Soviet soldiers, wearing uniforms better suited to autumn than Arctic winter, began freezing to death in their trenches. Their tanks, when they could move at all, were easy to spot and easier to avoid. The Finns, by contrast, had mastered winter warfare through generations of hunting and forestry. They struck at night on their silent skis, using the terrain to funnel their enemies into killing zones. When the battle ended, the Soviets had lost over 27,500 men. Finnish casualties numbered only 900. Suomussalmi demonstrated that superior numbers mean nothing without the ability to use them effectively. The Finns had turned winter itself into a weapon, using their intimate knowledge of forest warfare to neutralize an enemy that outnumbered them many times over. They proved that in the right hands, skis could defeat tanks, and knowledge of terrain could overcome overwhelming odds. The Winter War became a masterclass in asymmetric warfare, studied by military strategists to this day as the perfect marriage of tactical brilliance and environmental mastery. Lessons from the heights: transforming obstacles into opportunities. Mountains have never been mere obstacles, they are kingmakers. In each of these extraordinary victories, innovative commanders transformed what others saw as barriers into decisive advantages. But perhaps the most striking revelation isn't about tactics or strategy, it's about the human spirit's capacity to defy conventional wisdom. Every one of these victories began with someone looking at an impossible situation and seeing opportunity instead of defeat. These battles paint a fascinating pattern across history. The most decisive mountain victories weren't won by the armies with the best equipment or largest numbers, but by forces that understood three fundamental truths. First, that terrain is neutral. It becomes an ally only to those who truly understand it. Second, that conventional military doctrine often fails in mountainous environments, requiring innovation and adaptation. And third, that mountains amplify the impact of leadership and morale, turning small advantages into cascading victories. Today, as warfare evolves toward an increasingly technological future, these lessons remain surprisingly relevant. Modern military planners still grapple with the same fundamental challenge that faced Hannibal: how to turn geography from an enemy into an ally. The mountains have always known war, and they have always favored the bold, the innovative, and those willing to defy conventional wisdom. In the end, that may be their greatest lesson, that no obstacle, no matter how formidable, is truly insurmountable to those who dare to think differently.